The moment I knew Ilse Carver was in love with me had nothing to do with the way she looked at me across conference tables, or the 100 small details she had been keeping track of without my permission. It had nothing to do with the January she rearranged my deadline schedule around a dentist appointment I had mentioned in passing 7 weeks earlier. It had nothing to do with any of it. It had everything to do with a Tuesday afternoon in September. 3 hours after I told a room full of colleagues that another woman's lamb was the single most extraordinary thing I had eaten all year. She enrolled in culinary school by 4 o'clock that same afternoon. If you want to hear uncensored, too hot for YouTube stories, check out my Patreon in the description. Tell us where you are watching from and subscribe. My name is Tatum Reed, and for 11 months before everything I am about to tell you, I worked as the senior food content lead at Meridian Lifestyle Group under the direct editorial authority of Ilse Carver, which sounds like a professional credential and is also, it turns out, the most disorienting experience I have ever had the particular pleasure of not recovering from. Meridian was, depending on who you asked and when, either a boutique content agency with exceptional taste, a brand strategy firm with a food and culture editorial wing, or a small media company that had grown faster than its organizational structure in the 8 years since Ilse had built it from 3 people, and an editorial philosophy she had explained to exactly no one outside the building. The offices were in a brownstone near the park. Everything in the building was either deliberate or appeared deliberate, which amounted to the same thing in practice. The conference room had a long table the color of pale ash and exactly the right number of chairs. The kitchen had a 6-burner commercial range that Ilse had insisted upon during the renovation and that no one on staff, until recently, had ever used for anything more ambitious than espresso. I had joined Meridian 2.5 years before the Tuesday in question. I had come from a food and travel magazine where I had developed what my former editor called an alarmingly precise palate, and what I preferred to think of as the specific sensory intelligence that comes from eating seriously in many different cities for 6 years. I had applied to Meridian because of the quality of their editorial. I had accepted the offer because of Ilse Carver. She had interviewed me herself, not through HR, not through the editorial director, not through the hiring committee the company used for most positions. She had called me in on a Thursday and met me in the pale conference room and asked me, for 90 minutes, about every food experience I had found genuinely surprising in the previous year. She was not testing my credentials. She already knew my credentials. She was finding out whether I was paying attention to the right things in the right way. I was. She told me so on Friday morning when she called with the offer. She told me I was paying attention to the right things in the right way, and she needed someone in the building who could hold that quality of attention at the level of both editorial and sensory experience. She said it without flattery, the way she said most things, with the directness of someone who had decided that the honest version was more efficient than the managed one. I said yes. I moved my belongings from a sublet in Brooklyn to a 1-bedroom 6 blocks from the office. I started on a Monday in April. The first 3 months were what they always are. Learning the texture of a place, its rhythms and politics, and the specific vocabulary of its internal culture. Meridian had both warmth and precision in roughly equal measure, which was unusual and which reflected, I came to understand, the person who had built it. The staff was small enough that everyone knew everyone's work. The editorial standards were high enough that knowing everyone's work mattered. Ilse Carver ran it with the particular efficiency of someone who had decided, early on, that her job was to make excellent decisions and remove obstacles from the people positioned to make excellent work. She did not micromanage. She did not hover. She moved through the building once in the morning and once in the late afternoon, and conducted herself in meetings with a focused precision that I had seen make sponsors revise their creative briefs entirely, rather than argue, which I was told was a normal occurrence. She was 38. She wore her hair in a low, controlled style that worked for both a board presentation and a venue walkthrough without adjustment. She favored dark and neutral clothing, linen shirts, tailored trousers, occasionally a jacket in a color that was exactly 1 degree more interesting than it needed to be, which I noticed because I noticed things, and because Ilse Carver's choices were, it turned out, worth noticing. She spoke in complete sentences. She did not ramble. When she approved something, she said so cleanly, without caveats. When she had concerns, she named them specifically. She did not make you guess. She was, in short, the most competent person I had worked for. And I had worked for competent people. What I noticed in the first months, and what I told myself to stop noticing because it was not useful information, was that her attention to my work was particular. Not preferential in any visible way. She was not easier on me or harder on me than the editorial standards demanded. But she was present to my work in a way that registered differently than her presence to other people's work. She read my pieces before publication with a completeness that suggested she was reading for pleasure, as well as editorial rigor. She attended the content tastings I organized with full attention when her schedule would have reasonably allowed for a partial appearance. When I had a concern or a question, she addressed it the same day, without my having to follow up, which was not her pattern with anyone else on staff. I told myself she valued this area of the business. The food content was central to the brand. This was professional. That was true. It was also, I learned over 2 years, not the whole story. The small accumulation of details that I was cataloging without knowing I was cataloging. She knew my coffee order without being told, and it had arrived correctly at my desk on a Monday morning in my 2nd month before I had placed the order myself. She had the building run a climate adjustment for the corner of the office where my desk was, after a winter month of mild but genuine discomfort that I had mentioned to no one. She remembered the name of the restaurant in Porto that I had described in a team meeting as formative, and 3 months later sent me an article about that restaurant, with no comment except a small star in the subject line. When I worked late, she worked late, and she brought me tea at 8 in the evening with the same absence of ceremony she brought to every practical decision. Like it was simply the obvious right thing to do, and she had identified it and done it. None of it was inappropriate. None of it crossed a line. None of it could be held up to any standard and found wanting. It was the behavior of a boss who was exceptionally attuned to her team. It was also, I came to understand, the behavior of a woman who had decided that the professional container was the only one she was going to allow herself, and who was filling that container as fully as it could reasonably hold. I noticed this the way you notice something when you do not want to notice it. In peripheral vision, not head-on. I gave it no name. I went to work every morning and did my job with everything I had, because the work deserved it, and because Ilse Carver had built an environment where excellent work was both possible and expected, and I was grateful for both. The dinner was on a Tuesday in September. Meridian held quarterly inspiration events, dinners or experiences that the executive team and senior creative staff attended together, designed to do what company culture documents describe as cross-pollinating ideas, and what actually functioned as a way to keep a small team in the same room long enough to remember why they worked the way they worked. They were Ilse's invention. They reflected her editorial instinct. She believed that the quality of an organization's internal culture eventually surfaced in the quality of its output, and that you had to tend the former with the same intentionality you brought to the latter. This particular dinner was at Meridian's event space, a renovated lower level that the company used for brand activations and content productions. The walls were raw plaster, the lighting was warm and low, and the long central table had been set for 12 with the kind of understated care that said someone had thought about every placement. The smell of the kitchen was already in the air when we arrived. Something slow and spiced, something roasted, the particular warmth of a dinner that has been in preparation for hours. Petra Santos was cooking. Petra was a culinary consultant in her early 30s who had been working with a restaurant group that Meridian was developing a content partnership with. She had a reputation in the food world that had been building for several years, the kind of reputation that the industry knows before the general public does, that particular underground currency of people who pay serious attention to food. She was warm in the way some professionals are warm without it ever being performed, genuinely present, curious, the kind of person who made a room feel a little more alive without seeming to try. She and I had a professional relationship that had become, over months of partnership development, comfortable and collegial. We had shorthand around flavor and technique. We had shared a long lunch at a place she wanted to try and talked for 3 hours about the way acidity functions in different cultural food traditions, which is the kind of conversation that tells you everything about a person's intelligence. I liked her. She was straightforward to like. There was nothing complicated about liking her, except for the degree to which I later understood that Ilse Carver had been watching me like her, with the specific quality of attention reserved for things that cost you something to witness. The dinner was 12 people. Ilse at one end of the long table, various department heads and senior staff filling in the seats. The low, warm light of the event space doing what good lighting does in a room of people who are allowing themselves to relax. Petra served in courses. The bread was made that afternoon, and it was the kind of bread that made everyone at the table go quiet for a moment. Yeasty and warm, and with a crust that had exactly the right resistance. The first course was a cold preparation, summer vegetables, something fermented and bright, a texture that asked for attention rather than simply providing pleasure. The second was a fish I did not usually choose and ate 3 times more of than I had planned. And then there was the lamb. It came in a way I was not expecting, not carved and presented but slow cooked and falling apart, with preserved lemon and pomegranate, and a herb I could identify as some cousin of za'atar, but could not name precisely, and underneath all of it something deeply savory that I spent the entire first bite trying to locate, and the second bite deciding I did not care about locating because the experience of it was larger than the analysis. The fat had rendered down into the pomegranate reduction in a way that made the sweetness work without being sweet, and the acid from the preserved lemon arrived at the end of each bite like a question being answered just as you had stopped expecting the answer. I said it before I had decided to say it. I had been reaching for a second piece of the flatbread, and I put down the bread and I said, to no one in particular and therefore to the entire table, "This lamb is the single most extraordinary thing I have eaten all year." The table received this well. Petra, at the kitchen pass, looked over with a warmth that was genuine and not performed. Brig Hadley, who had been with the company nearly as long as Ilse had, and who was physically incapable of reacting to anything as though it surprised her, gave a single appreciative nod that from Brig was equivalent to a standing ovation. Jules Park, the junior content associate who sat to my left and who had the expressive face of someone who had not yet learned to modulate her responses, looked between me and the kitchen with undisguised delight and made a small sound of enthusiastic agreement. I did not look at Ilse. Then I did. She was looking at me. Not at Petra, not at the dish, not at the general congratulatory scene unfolding around the table. She was looking at me with an expression that was doing precisely the same thing her expression always did, holding still, revealing nothing. And then she looked at her plate and picked up her wine glass in the particular deliberate way she used when she was deciding to not be somewhere in her mind. when she had decided to be somewhere else and was choosing the motion of wine to assist the transition. It lasted less than 2 seconds. I had been cataloging her 2-second moments without knowing I was doing it for the better part of a year. I filed it away in the place I was calling the periphery and not looking at directly. The dinner ended. The kitchen was cleaned. The 12 of us dispersed into the cool September night. Petra and I stood on the pavement outside for 10 minutes talking about the herb. It turned out to be a specific cultivar she sourced from a small grower in New Jersey, grown in a particular soil composition that intensified the volatile oils. And I saw, at the edge of my awareness, Ilse Carver getting into a car at the far end of the street. She did not look back. By 4 o'clock the following afternoon, I knew about the culinary school because Jules told me. Jules had excellent instincts and catastrophically poor judgment about which information required discretion, which made her both a liability and an asset in the way young people with excellent instincts and poor filters always are. She came to my desk at 4:15 with the expression of someone carrying a piece of news that was too interesting to sit on and had been sitting on it for several hours already and was done with the effort. "Did you know Ilse enrolled in a cooking class?" she said. I looked up from the piece I was editing. "I need you to say more words," I said. Jules said Marina mentioned it. Apparently it showed up on Ilse's calendar the previous afternoon. A recurring block every Thursday evening starting the following week. Marina said it was with a culinary school. Not a recreational class, the professional kind. I looked at Jules. Jules looked at me. We were both doing the arithmetic on the timeline, and I could see her arriving, approximately 2 seconds after me, at the same conclusion. She said, "She enrolled literally the day after the dinner." "I know," I said. "Is that?" Jules began, and then stopped herself with an effort that was unusual, and spoke to the degree of the obvious contained in the sentence she had chosen not to finish. "Back to your desk," I said. Jules went. I sat at my desk for 5 minutes with my cursor blinking at the middle of a sentence about provenance and fermentation, and I thought about the timing. Tuesday evening, the dinner, the lamb, my declaration at the table in front of 11 colleagues, Wednesday before end of business, an enrollment in professional culinary instruction, recurring Thursdays, beginning immediately. The logic of it landed with a precision that was almost funny. Almost. Ilse Carver was the CEO of a lifestyle brand. She was not a cook. She had, in 2.5 years of my tenure, not demonstrated any particular personal investment in food preparation. She had opinions about food. Strong and specific ones. But they were the opinions of a serious consumer of culinary culture, not a practitioner of it. She ordered from the same 3 restaurants when she worked late. She drank her coffee without milk, and her tea without anything, and she ate at her desk on editorial deadline days with the focused absence of interest of someone who had decided that sustenance was a variable to be managed rather than an experience to be had. She had enrolled in professional culinary instruction 17 hours after I called another woman's cooking the most extraordinary thing I had eaten all year. I told myself, business development, the restaurant partnership. She is benchmarking. She is learning the field at a depth that allows her to lead the partnership with authority. This is how Ilse Carver approaches every sector she wants to understand, comprehensively and firsthand. I told myself this for approximately 20 minutes. The part of me that had been paying close attention for a year did not believe it for most of that time, and said so clearly at the end. I picked up my coffee and went back to the fermentation piece. I did not ask her about it directly. I want to be precise about why. Asking her about it required me to choose between the professional explanation and the other one. And as long as I did not ask, I could maintain the productive fiction that only one of those explanations existed. I was aware this was not the most useful version of courage. I was also aware that Ilse Carver, when asked a direct question she did not want to answer, was capable of producing a response so technically accurate and so emotionally evacuated that you walked away from the conversation believing you had received an answer when you had actually received a performance of one. I was not ready for that conversation yet. The Thursdays began. I did not know what happened at the Thursdays except in aggregate, over time, in the way evidence accumulates when you are paying close attention. Thursday evening she left the office at 6:30, which was an hour earlier than her normal departure. She returned to the building on Fridays in clothing that, once I started looking, occasionally carried a faint trace of something. Spice. Something roasted, the warmth of a kitchen that had been in use. Underneath the professional neutral of whatever jacket she had chosen. She did not mention the Thursdays. She did not volunteer anything about them. She carried them the way she carried everything personal, at a remove, behind the composure, in the part of herself she had designated as not available for discussion. The food appeared for the first time on a Friday in October. It was in the break room, on the large kitchen table people used for communal lunches. A rectangular ceramic dish covered with a cloth. No note, no attribution. I lifted the cloth. It was a grain dish. Farro, I thought, with roasted root vegetables and a bright, acidic element I identified after a moment as some kind of pickled citrus, and a garnish of herbs so precisely chosen and placed that it looked like something you would serve at an event rather than leave anonymously on a communal table. Someone in the kitchen said, "I think it might be from Ilse." I looked at the dish for a long time. Marina confirmed it later that day. Ilse had brought it in that morning, in the ceramic dish, without comment. She had placed it in the break room herself at 7:45. She had not indicated that she had made it. She had not suggested anyone eat it. She had, in Marina's words, simply put it down and walked to her office. I ate 3 servings. It was remarkable. Not showy. Everything in it was in service of the dish, rather than in service of demonstrating technique. But it had the quality I associated with cooking done by someone who was thinking very carefully about the experience of eating it, which was different from cooking done by someone who was thinking about the quality of their own execution. There was a warmth in the spice that landed first and a brightness in the acid that arrived last, and between those two things, everything else moved in a sequence that felt considered rather than accidental. She was making food for a specific palate. I was not going to survive this. Over the following weeks, the pattern established itself with a clarity I found almost admirable in its commitment. The break room dishes appeared on irregular Fridays, never announced, never attributed except by inference. They were always excellent. They escalated in technical complexity in a way that tracked exactly with what a serious culinary student would be learning over the first 2 months of professional instruction. The grain dishes gave way to composed preparations. The composed preparations gave way to things with sauces. The sauces gave way to things I could not fully decode on the first taste, which meant she had moved into territory that required more than I had accounted for. She did not look at me differently when these things appeared. She did not reference them in any conversation. She navigated every interaction with me with the same professional precision that had characterized our working relationship from the beginning. She approved my editorial work. She attended my content meetings. She sent me the occasional email with a starred subject line, an article, a restaurant opening, a technique piece from a culinary journal she had evidently subscribed to. She did not explain the starred articles. She did not need to. I read all of them. I thought about her reading them first and deciding I should read them after. I was cataloging all of it. I had been cataloging all of it for months. I had a very clear picture forming in my mind, and I was choosing, with the specific obstinacy of someone who understands that naming a thing changes it permanently, not to complete the picture. Brig Hadley ended that on a Wednesday afternoon in November. Brig had been at Meridian for 6 years. She was 41, had worked in food and lifestyle media since she was 23, and had the unflappable quality of someone who had processed every possible form of professional complication and come out the other side with a sharper sense of humor and a complete inability to pretend she did not see what she clearly saw. She was the warmest person in the building and also the most direct one, which was a combination that made her both the most sought-after lunch companion and the person no one wanted to sit across from when they were being imprecise about something they knew was true. We were in the back garden of the brownstone on that Wednesday afternoon, both of us with coffee, both of us taking 5 minutes away from our screens. It was cold enough to be uncomfortable. Neither of us had moved inside because the outside was quiet in a way the inside was not. The garden had the particular stripped-down quality of late autumn, most of the plantings cut back, the iron chairs still in place because someone had forgotten to store them. Brig said, "She's getting better." I looked at her. "The dish last Friday," Brig said, looking at her coffee. "The leek preparation with the aged vinegar. She is getting better faster than is normal for someone who started this recently." I did not confirm or deny anything, I said. "You are also the only person in the building who takes 3 servings, she said. "I take 3 servings because they're excellent." Brig said nothing. She drank her coffee. She looked at the bare November garden with the expression of someone who had already finished the thought she was waiting to deliver. She said, "You know why she's doing this?" "I know several possible explanations," I said. Brig said, "One of those explanations is professional development for the restaurant partnership." She used that phrase once to Marina when Marina asked directly. I want you to note that she used it exactly once, in exactly that one exchange, and has not used it since. I held my coffee. She said, "The other explanation is that you sat at a dinner table in September and told 12 people that Petra Santos made the best food you had eaten all year, and Ilse Carver heard you say it. And the following afternoon she enrolled in professional culinary training, and she has been bringing food that is specifically tailored to your preferences into this building every week since." I said, "I haven't told her my preferences." "She knows them," Brig said. "That is the entire point." We stood in the cold for a while. The neighbor's garden on the other side of the fence had a late-season rosemary that was still putting out new growth, and the smell of it came over the wall in the thin afternoon air. I said, "What am I supposed to do about it?" Brig said, "That is absolutely not a question I am going to answer for you." She went inside. I stood in the garden for another 10 minutes, which the cold made unpleasant, and which I did anyway because the alternative was going inside and completing the picture I had been refusing to complete for 2 months. Ilse Carver, who I reported to, who had built the organization that employed me, who wore dark neutral clothing and spoke in complete sentences, and had a composure I had never seen crack in 2.5 years, had enrolled in professional culinary training because I called another woman's cooking extraordinary, had been producing increasingly precise and elegant food in that professional kitchen on Thursday evenings, and leaving it anonymously in a break room on Friday mornings without attribution or expectation, had been sending me starred articles about techniques and flavors and restaurant culture with no explanation, because the articles were the explanation. There was only one reading of this. There was also only one consequence of the reading, and the consequence was that I worked for her, and she was the best professional context I had ever been in. And doing anything with the reading required both of us to navigate something that the professional structure of our working relationship made genuinely complicated. Not impossible, genuinely complicated in the way things are complicated when they are real rather than theoretical. I went inside. I did not ask her about it that week. I did not ask her about it the following week. The November dishes continued to appear on Fridays. The starred emails continued to arrive. The Tuesday editorial meetings proceeded with their usual professional efficiency, and Ilse sat at the head of the pale ash table and ran them with the focused precision that had always characterized her leadership, and I sat in my usual chair and presented my content proposals and received her feedback and registered, from the periphery, the quality of her attention. In December, the Meridian Winter Showcase arrived. The showcase was the company's signature annual event, the culmination of the year's work, a 3-hour evening in the event space that was equal parts portfolio presentation and experiential gathering, attended by the clients, partners, and industry contacts who made up Meridian's professional world. Every year it had a food component designed by the editorial team. Every year I oversaw that component. It was the highest profile thing I did all year, and I took it seriously in the particular way you take seriously the thing you are most publicly accountable for. This year, the showcase had an additional complexity. Petra Santos and the restaurant group were among the featured partnerships, which meant Petra would be present at the event, and her work would form part of the food story we were telling to the room. I had been working with her for 6 weeks on the showcase menu component. We had met 5 times in the event space kitchen. We had 2 additional sessions scheduled before the showcase date. On 3 of those 5 occasions, Ilse had been in the building during the meeting and had not appeared in the kitchen, which I had registered the same way I registered all the small evidence, quietly, from the periphery, noting it and setting it down. 3 days before the showcase, Ilse came to my desk. She said, "I would like to contribute something to the food component." I looked up from the editorial calendar I had been reviewing. She was standing at the edge of my workspace in the dark blazer and white shirt she had worn to the Tuesday editorial meeting, and she had the expression she wore when she was presenting a decision she had already made as a request in order to be polite, which was a distinct expression I had learned to identify. The composure fully in place, the decision already finalized underneath it. I said, "You want to cook something for the showcase?" She said, "A single item, aligned with the partnership story. I would like to use the kitchen downstairs tomorrow afternoon to test it, if the space is available." I said, "Can I ask why?" She said, "Because I believe the editorial story we're telling this year benefits from a proprietary element that demonstrates the quality of our internal culinary perspective at the highest level of the event." I said, "That is a very tidy sentence." She said, "Thank you. Is the kitchen available?" "It is," I said. She nodded. She turned and walked back toward her office. I watched her go. I thought about the phrase internal culinary perspective and decided that it was the most architecturally elegant professional euphemism I had encountered in any of our conversations to date. I also thought about the fact that she had not waited for me to agree or question the premise before she had already arranged the kitchen access through Marina, which meant the decision had been made and the request was a courtesy. She tested the dish on Thursday afternoon. I will be precise about this, because precision seems important in retrospect. I deliberately happened to be in the event space kitchen at the same time, working on logistics for the showcase layout. The kitchen was a proper commercial installation, 6-burner range, professional hood, workspace designed for events at scale. The surfaces stainless and clean in the way commercial kitchens are clean, functionless, practical, lit for performance, rather than atmosphere. She was at the far end of the preparation counter when I came in, and she looked at me with the level attention she brought to unexpected variables, and then continued what she was doing without comment. I stayed. I told myself it was logistics. I sat at the kitchen table and worked on a seating schematic for 20 minutes while she worked at the counter. The kitchen filled slowly with a smell I could not immediately identify and then could. Warm spice, a little smoke, something sweet underneath that was caramelizing at the edge between sugar and savory. The smells layered with a precision that was exactly like her. each element arriving in the right sequence, nothing competing, nothing wasted. She plated something. She set it at the far end of the counter. She looked at it for a long moment with the specific critical attention she brought to editorial proofs, the kind of attention that checks for what is missing as much as for what is present. Then she said, "Tell me what you think." I walked to the counter. The dish was small, a composed single bite, designed for a standing reception, the kind of thing that asks to be eaten in one considered moment rather than dissected. Roasted stone fruit with a spiced oil, something fermented and bright underneath the sweetness, on a base I could not identify on sight. I tasted it. It was extraordinary. Not the same extraordinary as Petra Santos's lamb, different in kind, different in intention. More restrained, more architectural. Built on precision rather than warmth, on structure rather than abundance. It was a dish that wanted you to think while you ate it, that asked a question rather than giving an answer. The stone fruit had been roasted to the exact degree that intensified its sweetness without eliminating its astringency, and the fermented element arrived on the back of the palate after the oil in the way that made the whole thing feel sequenced rather than simultaneous. It was exactly the kind of food I found most interesting. I said, "The base is a grain." "What grain?" She said, "Emmer. Toasted before cooking, which deepens the nuttiness and changes the way it absorbs the oil." I said, "The acid." She said, "Fermented green plum. The acidity is delayed. It arrives after the fat of the oil, which was the specific effect I was after." I said, "It's very good." She said, "I know." I looked at her. She was looking at the dish. I said, "Ilse." She said, "The proportions need adjustment on the oil. I'll rework them tomorrow." I said, "That's not what I was going to say." She looked at me then. The kitchen hummed around us. The overhead lights were the practical brightness of commercial kitchens, not forgiving, and in that light her composure was visible as the effort it was, in a way it usually was not. Something at the corners of her eyes, something in the controlled set of her jaw that was a degree more deliberate than a simple kitchen conversation required. I said, "You enrolled in culinary school the day after the dinner." She said, "My participation in continuing education is a business development." I said, "Ilse, don't." The word landed cleanly. A silence opened around it. The range ticked somewhere below audible. Outside the kitchen door, in the event space, a member of the setup team was moving chairs. She said, "The restaurant partnership required a deeper understanding of..." I said, "That's the same sentence you've been using since October. I stopped believing it a while ago." Her jaw shifted. Barely. A millimeter. "Enough." She said, "Tatum." I said, "I'm listening." She looked at the dish, then at the counter. Then, with the precision of someone reaching a decision they had been approached for a long time, at me. She said, "The culinary school was not about the restaurant partnership." 3 seconds of absolute quiet. The kitchen held the warmth of the afternoon's cooking. I said, "Then what was it about?" She turned away. She picked up the dish and moved it to the preparation counter closer to the range, creating distance using motion the way she sometimes created distance using language, reorganizing the physical space between us in the only way currently available to her. She covered the dish with a cloth. She removed her apron with the same efficiency she brought to every transition. She said, "I am going to rework the oil proportions tomorrow." I said, "That's not an answer." "I know," she said. She walked to the door. She stopped with one hand on the frame and stood there for one moment that was longer than the time required to open a door. She said, "Your 3 o'clock tomorrow is the showcase logistics call. I moved it to 2 so you have the afternoon." I said, "Thank you." She said, "The dish is better than I expected it to be at this stage." I said, I know. I told you it was very good. A pause. One breath. The kind of pause that happens when someone is deciding whether to say the thing they came to say. She said, "You told Petra Santos her lamb was extraordinary." And then she walked out, and the kitchen door swung shut behind her. And I stood at the preparation counter in the bright commercial light with the cloth-covered dish and the smell of roasted stone fruit and warm spice in the air, and the exact words she had just said settling into the room like something that had finally finished falling. You told Petra Santos her lamb was extraordinary. Not, the dishes are not comparable. Not. This is a different register entirely. Not any of the elegant deflections available to her. She had said it in a voice that was stripped of the professional frame, the particular voice that emerged when the management of something had exceeded the container built to hold it, and she had walked out of the kitchen before I could answer. She had given me the fragment and removed herself from the proximity of my response. I stood there for a long time. The maintenance crew moved chairs on the other side of the door. The range ticked as the pilot light held its low, steady flame. Outside the high kitchen window, the December light was doing what December light does in the late afternoon. Going gold and horizontal, catching the dust in the air, making the ordinary room look briefly significant. She had enrolled in culinary school the afternoon after the dinner. She had been making food calibrated to my specific palate for 3 months and leaving it in a break room without attribution. She had sent me starred articles from culinary journals she subscribed to for reasons she did not explain, because the reasons were the explanation. She had tasted her own dish in front of me and said "I know" in the particular tone she used when she had already accounted for something fully. And she had walked out of this kitchen saying, "You told Petra Santos her lamb was extraordinary." I understood what she had told me. I also understood that she had walked out before I could respond, which was not an accident. She had crossed 1 millimeter of the distance that existed between us, and then put the rest of it carefully back. The showcase was in 3 days. I went upstairs. I sat at my desk and looked at the cursor blinking in the middle of a sentence, and I thought about the timing. September, the dinner, the lamb, the declaration at the table. 17 hours later, a culinary enrollment. 3 months of increasingly precise food appearing on Friday mornings with no note and no claim. And I thought about the word extraordinary in her voice, in that kitchen, and what it had cost her to say it. She did not do anything without a reason. She had a reason for every decision, and she accounted for every cost before she made the decision. She had been accounting for this one for 3 months, and she was still accounting for it. Still running the calculation, still finding that the cost of saying anything direct exceeded the container of what she had decided was permissible. But she had said it. 4 words in a kitchen, with her hand on the door, before she walked out. Not enough to act on. Not enough to call an answer. Large enough that I was going to be thinking about it for 3 days, which she knew, which meant she had left it deliberately. She had left it for me to hold. She had crossed the 1 millimeter and then stepped back, and I was standing in a commercial kitchen at 4:30 in December, with the evidence of 3 months of careful, specific, unreachable attention, and 4 words that were not a confession and not nothing, and I had no architecture for any of it. I closed the seating schematic. I opened the showcase programming narrative. I worked for 2 hours with the kind of focused professional competence that functions as its own form of avoidance. And when I left the building that evening, the December cold was sharp, and the street was full of people moving through the city with the specific urgency of the last weeks before the year ended. And I walked 6 blocks home thinking about roasted stone fruit and fermented plum, and the particular way she said, "I know." The Friday before the showcase, the break room had a new dish. I came in at 8 in the morning to a building that was already active. The setup crew for the evening's event arriving at the service entrance, Marina at her desk with both screens lit. The low-level electric tension of a company 24 hours from its most public night of the year. The event space downstairs was already being transformed. I could hear it from the lobby. Furniture on bare floors, the sound of flowers being uncrated, voices coordinating in the specific registers of people who do this professionally and enjoy the efficiency of doing it well. I dropped my bag at my desk and went to the kitchen for coffee. The ceramic dish was on the table, covered with the cloth I recognized. I stood there for a moment. Then I lifted the cloth. She had reworked the oil proportions. I knew this before I tasted it because the visual composition was different. The oil distributed differently across the grain base. No longer concentrated at the center but spread in a way that told me she had adjusted the emulsification. I tasted it anyway, standing at the kitchen table in my coat, and understood immediately what she had done. The fat element now released before the fermented plum arrived, which reversed the sequence from the day before, and made the acid the last thing rather than a near-simultaneous note. It was better. Significantly better. It was, in fact, exactly what the dish had been asking for. She had come in early enough to have been here before 7, which meant she had been in this kitchen in the half-dark of a December morning reworking a dish she had described as needing adjustment, and she had left it in the break room with the same absent attribution as every other Friday, and she was now in her office running an editorial company on the day of its largest annual event. I covered the dish. I poured my coffee. I stood in the break room for a minute with my coffee, and thought about what kind of person drives themselves toward excellence at 6 in the morning for a thing nobody has asked them to do, and then leaves the result without their name on it. I thought, I know exactly what kind of person. I went to my desk and worked through the morning on final showcase preparations. At 10, Jules appeared at my desk with her tablet and a list of last-minute logistics questions, and I answered them all and sent her back with additional instructions about the food display sequence. At 11, Ilse's office door was open, and she was on a call that I could not hear but could see. Her profile at the window, the particular economy of her gestures when she was managing a stakeholder who required more management than she would ideally prefer to give. She did not come out of her office until noon. She came to my desk at noon with 2 printed pages, the revised showcase program, changes marked in her precise handwriting, and set them down and said, "The second panel order needs adjustment. The partnership narrative reads better if the restaurant content comes before the editorial overview." I looked at the pages. She was right. "I said so," she said. "Marina has the final print run at 2. Let me know if there are other changes." She started to walk back toward her office. I said, "The dish this morning." She stopped. "The oil adjustment," I said. "The reversal of the acid arrival." That was right. A pause. The building moved around us. The setup crew, the phones, the ordinary machinery of a workday. She said, "I thought so." I said, "The dish is ready for tonight." She said, "Good." She walked back to her office. I watched her go. The door did not close all the way. It rested 2 inches open in the way her door sometimes rested, when she was not actively requiring the separation that a fully closed door provided, and I understood that this, too, was a choice she had made. The showcase began at 6. The event space had been transformed with the specific elegance that Meridian's production team achieved when given enough runway and a clear brief. Warm light from low fixtures, the food displays arranged along one wall at the height of easy conversation rather than exhibition, clusters of seating that encouraged the particular intimacy of a room where people are supposed to impress each other but prefer to feel comfortable first. The client base was mid-sized to large, restaurant groups, hospitality brands, culinary media ventures, 2 publishing houses that handled food titles, the kind of room where everyone knew one another at one remove and greeted each other with the particular warmth of professional affinity. Petra was in the kitchen from 4 o'clock, running the final preparations for her component with the efficient focus of a chef who knows exactly what she is doing and does not require supervision. I checked in with her at 5:30 and she waved me off with a smile that told me she had it and I should stop hovering. I respected that and moved to the rest of the display. Ilsa's dish occupied a small section of the food table, presented on the same rectangular ceramic with a small card that read, "Composed bite, roasted stone fruit, fermented plum, emmer." It had no attribution. I had placed the card myself because Ilsa had not, and I had not put her name on it because she had not asked me to, and I was beginning to understand that the attribution question was a larger one than it appeared. Guests arrived at 6. The room filled with the sound and warmth of a well-organized gathering, the specific acoustic of a crowd that is pleased to be where it is. I moved through the room doing what the evening required, connecting people with the right conversations, making the food content feel like narrative rather than display, fielding the questions about the partnership that would become editorial next quarter. Petra circulated in the room after the first service, moving through the guests with the ease of someone who understood that the best thing a chef can do at a client event is be genuinely present rather than professionally visible. People responded to her the way people respond to warmth that does not ask for anything back. I watched Ilsa from across the room. She was, as she always was in these contexts, exceptional. She moved through the space with the contained efficiency I had been cataloging for 2.5 years. Complete attention for whoever she was speaking with, precise transitions between conversations, the kind of presence that made a room feel managed without anyone being aware of being managed. She wore a dark suit and a silk shirt the color of deep water, and the watch on her right wrist caught the light once when she turned. She did not look at the food table. At 7:30, a woman appeared at the food display and spent a long time at Ilsa's dish. Her name was Rosa Chen. She was the editor-at-large for a prominent food and culture quarterly and, she had, in the decades since she had taken the role, developed a reputation for noticing things before the rest of the industry had finished deciding whether the things were worth noticing. She was in her mid-40s, wore her silver hair short, and had the specific quality of attention that belonged to people who had spent 20 years taking food seriously enough to understand what it was actually about. She tasted the composed bite. She stood still for a moment. She tasted it again. She found me at the edge of the room. "Who made this?" she said, holding the small plate, the stone fruit piece. I said, "It's from Meridian." She looked at me. "That is not the answer to the question I asked." I said, "It's something our CEO developed. She's been cooking for several months." Rosa looked back at the display, then back at me. Her face was doing the thing that a face does when something has clicked into place. She said, "That dish is a love letter in food form. I mean that technically, not as a figure of speech. It's composed for a specific palate. Every decision in it is in service of a particular eater rather than a general standard." I did not say anything. She said, "Someone made that dish for someone else to eat. You can taste the specificity of the intention. It is..." She paused, with the precision of someone choosing the right word. "It is extraordinary." She said the word like she was placing it exactly where she intended it to land. Then she moved away into the room, toward Ilsa, who was across the space talking with 2 clients, and I watched Rosa Chen introduce herself to Ilsa and watched Ilsa receive the introduction with the professional composure she brought to every new contact, and watched the conversation last 4 minutes, and watched Ilsa, once, during those 4 minutes, look across the room at me. She looked away before I had time to decide what to do with the look. At 9, the room had thinned to the core of the evening. The people who had stayed because they were actually interested rather than because the event required their presence. Petra came out of the kitchen with a small plate of something new, a late addition, something she had been working on and had decided on impulse to share. and the remaining guests gathered around with the particular pleasure of an unexpected gift. I went to the prep kitchen. Ilse was there. She had come in after the main service and was at the counter with the ceramic dish and a cloth, clearing with the focused practicality she brought to transitions. She heard me come in and did not turn. I said, "Rosa Chen called the dish a love letter in food form." A pause in the motion at the counter. She said, "Rosa Chen has been the most accurate food writer in this industry for 15 years. I said, "She called it extraordinary." Ilse set down the cloth. She was very still at the counter, facing the stainless surface with her shoulders in the careful line of someone who was deciding, again, between the professional answer and the other one. I said, "You adjusted the oil this morning." She said, "The composition needed it." I said, "You came in before 7 on the day of our biggest event of the year to rework a dish that nobody asked you to make for a showcase where nobody knew it was yours." She turned around. The kitchen was quiet. The guests on the other side of the door. The prep crew done and gone, the event winding down toward its natural close. In this light she looked the way she had looked in the kitchen the afternoon before. The composure present and visible as the work it was, the thing it was containing visible at the edges in the controlled line of her jaw, and the way she met my eyes and held them without the professional deflection she usually inserted into the beat before she answered. I said, "Tell me what it was actually about." She said, "Tatum." I said, "We are the only 2 people in this kitchen and the event is almost over and the showcase is a success. And I am not your employee in this room right now. I am a person who has been holding a fragment of an answer since yesterday afternoon, and I need the rest of it." She looked at me for a long time. The range ticked on the low pilot flame. Outside, the faint sound of Petra's voice and a guest laughing, something warm and human on the other side of the door. She said, "I heard you say extraordinary, and I wanted to be the person you said it about." The kitchen contracted around those words, or became very aware of its own dimensions. I said, "That is not a professional explanation." She said, "No, it is not." I said, "Then what is it?" She looked at the counter, then at me, and something in her face that I had never seen moved. She said, "There is a restaurant in Porto. You described it in a team meeting 16 months ago. You called it formative. I looked it up that night when I got home. I stood there." She said, "I read everything they had ever published about their philosophy, about the specific way they approach acidity and fermentation and the relationship between technique and memory in food. I read it because you had used the word formative and I needed to understand what you meant by it. Not for editorial reasons." I said, "How long?" She said, "Since that meeting." I said, 16 months ago." She said, "Yes." I said, "You enrolled in culinary school in September." She said, "I enrolled in culinary school because you said Petra Santos made something extraordinary and I wanted—" She stopped. The sentence stopped. She picked it back up from a different angle, the way she did when the first approach had insufficient precision. "I wanted to make something you would call extraordinary." I understood that was not a rational response to a professional situation. I enrolled anyway. The kitchen held the smell of the evening, stone fruit, spice, the warm cedar and citrus trace of the guests who had moved through the event space, the particular combination of a December night and a kitchen that had been working all day. I said, "And the break room dishes." She said, "Were practice, were—" She stopped again. "Were what I could give you, while I was still trying to account for the rest." I said, "Without your name on them." She said, "If I put my name on them, they would require a response, and I had not yet." I said, "You had not yet decided whether you were going to say any of this." She said, "Yes." I said, "But you said it yesterday. 4 words in a kitchen doorway, and then you left." She said, "I know. I said more than I intended to, and then I left, before I said the part I couldn't walk back from. I said, "And tonight?" A silence. She looked at me steadily. The thing I had been watching bend across 11 months was not cracking. It was simply finishing its movement, arriving at the position it had been approaching since September, since the Porto meeting, since whatever morning she had looked up a restaurant in Porto because a person in her company had used the word formative. She said, "I have been in love with you since the Porto meeting. I have managed it, or attempted to manage it, with every professional tool I have. I made food for your specific palate, and left it without attribution because attribution required honesty I had not yet committed to. I enrolled in a culinary program because your declaration about another woman's cooking produced in me a response that I could not contain inside the coaching box I had built for it. And I told you yesterday that the culinary school was not about the restaurant partnership because I could not stand in this kitchen with you and say the smaller, more dishonest thing one more time." The room was entirely still. She said, "That is the full answer." I looked at her. This woman who had built an organization around precision and excellence, and the specific belief that honest attention to quality was the only sustainable foundation for good work. Who had been applying those same standards to the impossible calculation of loving someone she worked with and had arrived, by way of a culinary program and 3 months of anonymous break room offerings and 4 words in a doorway, at the only answer the calculation could produce. I said, "What are you going to do about it?" She said, "Tomorrow morning I am going to speak to Clara Strand about a voluntary structural disclosure. There is a conflict of interest framework in the organizational charter. I should have used it earlier. I am going to use it now." Clara Strand was the board chair. She was 62, had built 2 media companies before joining Meridian's board, and had the particular clarity of someone who had navigated every complicated situation an organization could produce, and come out with a functional preference for straightforward honesty over managed ambiguity. I said, "You'll change the reporting structure." She said, "You should not be reporting directly to me on matters of your own career. That was true before tonight, and it will be formalized tomorrow. The editorial director handles your advancement track. I recuse from any decisions that bear directly on your work." I said, "And the rest?" She looked at me. "The rest," she said, "is yours to determine. I am not going to tell you what the right response to this is. I am responsible for what I should have disclosed and what I should have structured. The rest belongs to you." I looked at her for a long time in that kitchen. The event was winding down on the other side of the door. Rosa Chen's observation was sitting in the room with us. A love letter in food form, technically, not as a figure of speech. Composed for a specific palate. I said, "Go talk to Clara Strand in the morning." She nodded. I said, "And then give me time." She said, "As much as you need." I said, "I need the rest of December and January." She held my gaze. "Okay," I said. "The Friday dishes can keep coming." Something moved across her face. 1 millimeter. The specific millimeter I had been cataloging for a long time. She said, "Yes." I said, "Put your name on them." A pause. Small and complete. She said, "All right." She picked up the ceramic dish. She went to the door. She stopped, for one beat, with her hand on the frame. The same position as the afternoon before, the same moment of decision. Though the decision this time was different in kind. She said, "Thank you for asking me to answer." I said, "You would have kept not answering indefinitely." She said, "Probably." She went through the door. I stood in the kitchen for a few minutes in the quiet and the smell of the evening, and then I went out to help close the showcase with the professionalism that the evening had earned. The structural disclosure happened the following morning. Ilse met with Clara Strand at 9. I was not in the meeting. I know what was said because Clara told me herself 2 days later in the matter-of-fact register of a board chair, who had decided the cleanest path was the direct one. Ilse had disclosed a personal conflict of interest relating to a member of staff, had recommended a specific restructuring of the direct reporting relationship, and had proposed a formal record in the organizational charter. Clara had approved the restructuring. The record was made. The editorial director, a woman named Harriet Vose, who had been at Meridian for 4 years and had been managing most of the daily editorial decisions anyway, became Tatum Reed's formal point of contact on professional development matters. Clara said to me, in the direct tone of a 62-year-old who did not feel the need to frame difficult truths in unnecessarily gentle language. She did this without being asked. "I want you to understand what that means about the quality of her judgment." I said I understood. Clara said, "Good. Then I will not say anything further about it." She did not. December passed. The break room dishes continued to appear on Fridays. They had her name now. A small card, handwritten, in the precise style of her handwriting. I, Carver. Nothing else. No explanation, no apology, no commentary. Just the attribution that made them real. The first Friday she put her name on it. Jules came to my desk at 10 in the morning with the expression of someone who has just had a theory confirmed by the universe in the most satisfying possible way. Jules said, "It says her name on it." "I know," I said. Jules looked at me. She looked at the ceiling. She opened her mouth. She closed it again. She went back to her desk without asking any of the questions that were clearly visible on her face, and I recognized this as genuine professional growth and was grateful for it. Brig found me in the back garden at lunch that same day. The December cold had softened slightly, still sharp but no longer hostile. The kind of cold that invites you to stay outside if you are wearing enough layers and have something worth staying outside for. She had 2 coffees and handed me one without being asked. She did not say anything for 5 minutes. Then she said, "The leek and preserved lemon dish from 3 weeks ago. The one with the ash oil. That was the best thing I have eaten in this building in 4 years." I said, "She's getting better." Brig said, "Faster than should be possible." I asked around. Apparently, the instructors at the program talk about her in the way instructors talk about students who make them recalibrate what motivated learning looks like. I held my coffee. Brig said, "I am choosing from this point forward to discuss only the food. The quality of the food and the remarkable rate of its improvement. Nothing else." She went inside. I stood in the December garden and thought about motivated learning and the instructors who could recognize it, and I thought about ash oil and fermented plum and the specific quality of attention that produced dishes composed for someone else's experience rather than the cook's own satisfaction. I ate my lunch alone and gave myself permission to think about it directly. I had told Ilse I needed the rest of December and January, and I had meant it. Not as punishment. Not as a test, not as distance for its own sake, but as the accurate time required to recalibrate after 11 months of living in the periphery of something I had been refusing to see head-on. There is a specific adjustment required when you stop looking at something sideways and start looking at it directly, and that adjustment takes the time it takes and cannot be shortened without consequence. I use the time honestly. I thought about the Porto meeting, which I remembered in the specific way you remember things that only become significant in retrospect. I had said the word formative in a Tuesday team meeting while thinking about an editorial calendar, and I had not thought about it again after the meeting because there were other things to think about. She had gone home that night and read everything available about the restaurant's philosophy, about their approach to acidity and fermentation, about the specific relationship between technique and memory that defined their work, because I had said formative and she needed to understand what I meant by it. Not for editorial reasons, because understanding what I meant was the thing she needed to do. I thought about this for a long time over December. I thought about what it meant to love someone's mind so completely that you needed to understand every reference they made in a casual team meeting. About the specific tenderness of that kind of attention. Not the attention of someone who wanted to impress, but the attention of someone who simply needed to know. I thought about the starred emails with the same deliberate focus I had been applying to everything in the December light. I went back through all 11 of them over the course of a long Sunday afternoon in the third week of December, reading each one with the knowledge of what I now knew, and the experience of rereading them was entirely different from the experience of receiving them. Each one was its own small record of a specific thought she had had about a specific thing I had said, translated into the only language she had given herself permission to use: a star, an article. The gesture of a woman who had decided that the professional container was the only one available to her and who had filled it with every honest thing that could possibly fit inside it. There were 11 over 2 years. I read them all. I thought about 11 moments of her reading something and thinking of me, and deciding that the star was the right next step. The one that did not require naming. The one that could be received as professional, and nothing more if I chose to receive it that way. I thought about the fact that she had known, every time she sent one, that I might receive it as professional and nothing more. That she had sent them anyway. That the sending was its own form of honesty even when the star was covering it. I thought about what it costs to love something so carefully and so completely, and find the container too small and keep trying to fit it in anyway. In January, Harriet Vose and I had 2 productive conversations about the food editorial direction for the coming year. Harriet was competent and precise, and gave feedback with the clean directness of someone who had not developed the habit of managing feelings instead of content, which was its own kind of clarity. She asked good questions. She had read my recent work with attention and had specific observations about where my editorial voice was developing in useful ways. The structural change was, professionally, functioning exactly as intended. The distance it created with Ilse was, as I had expected, both correct and strange to inhabit. She was still in the building, still the CEO. We passed in the corridor, sat in the same Tuesday editorial check-ins that she ran with the same professional precision they had always had, attended the same client meetings where the work required both of us to be present and professional and focused. The conversation in the kitchen had not been undone by January's structural adjustments. It lived in the building with us, in the specific space between the professional version of our interactions and the other thing, which was now named and had weight, and could not be walked back through any amount of organizational restructuring. She did not press. She gave me the time I had asked for with the complete honesty of someone who understood what giving time actually meant. Not strategic patience, not performed waiting, but the genuine accommodation of another person's necessary process. The difference between those things is visible to the person receiving them, and I received hers and understood what it was. She was warm when the work required warmth. She was precise when precision was what the moment called for. She was, in the daily texture of the building and the work, entirely, professionally, exactly what she had always been. And the thing that had always been different about her attention to me was still different in exactly the same ways. And we were both living with the knowledge that this was true without resolving it, which required a specific quality of honesty from both of us that I was learning to hold. And on Fridays, her name was on the break room dish. I, Carver, handwritten. Every time. The card placed to the right of the cloth in the same position each week, the writing in the same precise style, the attribution offered without drama and without explanation, because it was simply the accurate thing. The third Friday of January she made something with winter citrus and a slow-cooked legume and an herb oil that I could not immediately identify. I stood in the break room with my plate for a full minute, trying to locate the specific quality of the oil before I gave up, and ate the rest of the dish, and then stood there thinking about it for another minute. I still do not know what she used. I have not asked. Some things are better as open questions than answered ones. Carver. There it was. Clean and handwritten and entirely hers. The restaurant partnership launch was in February. It was a Thursday evening, a smaller gathering than the showcase, a client and trade event at the restaurant group's flagship location, the partnership between Meridian and the culinary world, made visible in the space that both represented. Petra Santos was there as the connecting figure between the two organizations. She was in her element in the way she was always in her element, engaged, warm, technically specific when the conversation called for it. Petra and I worked side by side through the early part of the evening managing the content presentation elements. At some point in the middle hours of the event, when the room had settled into the loose, comfortable energy of a gathering going well, she and I ended up at the edge of the room with our glasses and a moment of quiet. She said, "How are you?" I said, "Good." She looked at me with the clear, direct warmth that was entirely characteristic of her. She said, "I mean, how are you?" I said, "Also good." She turned and looked across the room. Ilse was at the far end, talking with the restaurant group's managing partner, fully in the professional register she inhabited so well. Petra said, "She trained for 3 months to make something you would find extraordinary. She came to every Thursday session with more preparation than anyone else in the program. She asked better questions. She worked harder. She left earlier than everyone else and came back the next week having practiced whatever the instructor had covered." I looked at Petra. She said, "I know one of the instructors from the program. She told me in November. She said there was a woman in the professional track who was clearly cooking for someone. That the intention in her work was entirely about a specific person's experience, rather than her own development as a cook. She said it was unusual, and it was the most committed technical learning she had seen in years." I said, "Petra," she said, "I'm not telling you what to do. I'm telling you what I know. She trained for 3 months to make something you would find extraordinary. That is not nothing. That is, in fact, a very specific something." She said it plainly, not dramatically, not as investment in the outcome. Just as the accurate statement of a thing she knew, offered to me in the way that precise people offer accurate things, cleanly, without decoration, and then moved on. She found someone else to talk to. She moved into the room with the ease of a person who has said the thing she intended to say and has no further agenda about it. I stood at the edge of the room with my glass and thought about 3 months of Thursday evenings in a professional culinary program, about practicing at home between sessions, about the instructor's observation, cooking for someone, the intention in the work entirely about a specific person's experience. I thought about this for the rest of February. In March, on a Wednesday afternoon when the late light was coming through the brownstone windows at the angle that meant spring was close but not yet committed, I went to Ilse's office door and knocked. "Come in." She was at her desk with a manuscript printout and a red pen, editorial work, the kind she still did personally on pieces she felt required her attention. She looked up. The pen went down. She said, "Tatum." I said, "I need you to tell me the rest." She said, "The rest." I said, "The parts you haven't said yet. The parts between the Porto meeting and the Thursday evenings, the parts between the starred emails and the break room dishes, all of it." She said nothing for a moment. Then she stood up, which meant she was deciding to be a person in the room rather than a professional behind a desk, and she moved to the 2 chairs by the window and sat in one of them. I sat in the other. Outside the window, the March light was doing what March light does in the late afternoon. Coming in lower than winter but carrying more warmth, the city outside beginning to remember what it feels like when the cold loosens. The building held the quiet of mid-afternoon. She said, "Where do you want me to start?" I said, "The starred emails." She looked at her hands. She looked at me. She said, "The first one was 3 months after you joined the company." I was reading a Norwegian fermentation journal. For a client brief, legitimate reading. And there was an article about a technique that I knew you would find interesting because of the way you had talked about the relationship between acid and thyme in the team tasting 2 weeks before. I sent it with a star because I was thinking about you when I read it and I did not know what else to do with that. I said, "That was 26 months ago." She said, "Yes." I let that sit. She said, "Each one after that was the same. Something I encountered that made me think of a specific thing you had said or a specific quality of attention you had brought to a specific subject." I sent them because the alternative was sending nothing and pretending I had not been thinking about you, which was less honest than the star. I said, "And the Porto article?" She said, "That was November. I found it through the Culinary journal I had subscribed to in September. I had been in the program for 8 weeks, and I was reading everything I could find about the philosophy behind the techniques I was learning, and I found an article about that restaurant and its philosophy, and I read it and thought, this is the thing she meant by formative. And I sent it because I wanted you to know I had understood." I said, "You wanted me to know you had understood what I meant by formative." She said, "Yes." I said, "And the culinary school. After everything you've told me, what it was actually like to decide to do that." She said, "You called her cooking extraordinary." I was sitting at the end of a dinner table with 11 other people and you said extraordinary, and it landed somewhere in my chest, and I drove home that night thinking about what I was doing and what I was not doing, and what I was going to keep allowing myself to not do, and the answer was... She paused, with the specific pause of someone choosing the honest word over the easier one. The answer was that I was afraid. I said, "Of what?" She said, "I have been running this company for 8 years. I have been the person who decides things in this building for 8 years. I am not afraid of rooms. I am not afraid of conversations. I have had difficult conversations with boards and clients and staff and media, and I have navigated all of them without the specific quality of terror that I felt when I thought about saying an honest thing to you." I said, "Because I work for you." She said, "Because I work for you. Because I had built something here, and you were part of what made it excellent, and the thought of being wrong about what I felt, or wrong about what was possible." She stopped. The thought of damaging either the building or you was more than I could hold alongside the honest answer. So I built the container instead. I said, "The Thursday evenings." She said, "Were the container becoming too small? Were me trying to give you something real when I had told myself the real version wasn't available?" I said, "They were extraordinary." She looked at me. Something in her face moved. I said, "Not extraordinary like Petra Santos's lamb." She said, "How?" I said, "Extraordinary the way something is extraordinary when it was made specifically for you. When every decision in it was in service of your experience, rather than any other standard." Rosa Chen called it a love letter in food form. She said she could taste the intention. A silence. The March light held the room. She said, "She was right." I said, "I know." I looked at her. This woman I had been looking at from the periphery for 2.5 years, who had been looking back from her own periphery for longer than I had known, and had managed the looking with the most extraordinary professional discipline I had ever witnessed, which was itself a form of devotion that the professional container had been barely wide enough to hold. I said, "The Friday dishes were the most specific thing anyone has ever done for me." She said, "I should have put my name on them from the beginning." I said, "You weren't ready." She said, "No." I said, "You're ready now." She said, "Yes." I said. Then I have conditions. She looked at me steadily. She had the composure fully in place in the way it was in place when it was doing its real job, not as a wall, not as a performance, but as the foundation under something that required a solid foundation. I said, "The cooking stays. It's yours and it is excellent, and I do not want you to stop being the person who does that." She said, "All right." I said, "The anonymity ends. It already ended." Which I know. But the spirit of it ends. If you make something you want me to eat, you tell me you made it. Not on a card. To my face. She said, "Yes." I said, "The starred articles continue. But you tell me what you were thinking when you read them. What you wanted me to think. Not a star. A sentence." She said, "That will require more exposure than a star." I said, "I know. Those are the terms." She said, "And the third one." I said, "You don't walk out of rooms when the conversation gets to the part you didn't intend to say." She looked at me. "You told Petra Santos her lamb was extraordinary," she said, in the voice she had used in the kitchen 2 nights ago, stripped of the professional frame, the smaller, more honest voice. I said, "You walked out after that." She said, "I panicked." I said, "I know. That was the most human thing I have ever seen you do, and I needed to sit with it for 3 months, and I have sat with it, and those are my terms." She looked at me for a long time. The late afternoon March light was in the room between us, and outside the window the city was starting its evening transition, the buildings going amber and the street below beginning to fill with the particular energy of a city remembering that it can be warm again. She said, "Those are difficult terms." I said, "I know. They're the right ones." A long quiet, honest and unmanaged. She said, "Yes. All 3." I said, "Good." I stood up. I walked around the desk to where she was sitting, and she looked up at me and for once did not compose herself for a professional encounter. Let the composure be what it actually was, which was not armor and not distance, and not the management of something too large to hold, but simply the steady foundation of a person who had spent 2 years being honest about everything except the most important thing and was done with the exception. I put my hand over hers where it rested on the arm of the chair. Her hand went very still. Then it turned, slowly, and her fingers closed around mine. The contact was warm and certain, and had the specific quality of something that had been waiting exactly the right amount of time, not too long, and not before it knew what it was. I said, "You enrolled in culinary school the afternoon after I called another woman's cooking extraordinary." She said, "Yes." I said, "That is the most specific love declaration I have ever received." She said nothing. Her hand was warm in mine and the March light was in the room, and she was looking up at me with the thing that had been underneath all of it for 2.5 years, finally visible on the surface of her face. And it was, as I had understood for some time, worth the full cost of everything it had taken to get here. I leaned down and kissed her. Not frantic, patient. Warm and deliberate and built on everything that had come before it. The Porto meeting and the starred emails and the Thursday evenings and the break room dishes and the kitchen doorway and the December showcase and the March afternoon. All of it present in the patience of that kiss, which was not the end of something but the beginning of something that had been in preparation for a long time and was finally ready to be real. She kissed me back. Her free hand came to my jaw, gentle and precise, the same hands that had adjusted oil proportions at 6 in the morning and placed herbs with the care of someone who understood that detail was the difference between good and extraordinary, the same precision, the same intention. When I straightened, she looked at me with the composure that was real and the warmth underneath it that was also real, and the specific expression of someone who has paid a significant cost and has arrived, finally, at the thing the cost was for. She said, "The dish for next Friday." I said yes. She said, I want to try something with a new acid component. Something I've been working on in the Thursday sessions. I need a palate I trust. I said. My terms included you telling me to my face. She said, I am telling you to your face. I said, then yes. She said, come on Thursday. Not the break room. Here. The kitchen downstairs? I said, what time? She said, 6. I'll have the range ready. I said, I'll bring the wine. She said, you don't know what I'm making. I said, I know you well enough. The corner of her mouth moved. 1 millimeter. The specific millimeter I had been cataloging since October, and which was, now that it was not being maintained at professional distance, even better than I had accounted for. I said, I'll see you Thursday. She said, Thursday? I went back to my desk. The building was doing its late afternoon wind down around me. The particular quiet that settles over a small organization when the day is finishing, and people are beginning the mental transition toward the evening. Jules was at her desk with her earphones in, working through something with the focused energy of someone on a deadline. Brig was in the kitchen, which I could tell because I could smell the particular herbal tea she drank at 4 in the afternoon. I opened my editorial calendar. I looked at Thursday. I looked at the empty space at 6 in the evening and the specific warmth of knowing what was going to fill it. I was not going to survive this. I had known that since October. I was now glad I had been right. June came with the particular confidence of a New York early summer, warm and bright, and carrying the specific energy of a city that has been patient about warmth for long enough to receive it with full enthusiasm. The food and lifestyle media industry held its annual summer gathering at a venue in the meatpacking district. A large, airy space full of the kind of people who thought carefully about what they ate and were not apologetic about this. Meridian was presenting. I was presenting the food content portfolio, the year's editorial, the partnership narrative, the direction forward. I had built the presentation around the principle that the best food content comes from genuine investment in what food actually does, the way it carries memory, the way it creates specificity of intention, the way the best dishes are never really about technique, but about the particular someone the technique is in service of. I knew where this philosophy had come from. I was not apologetic about that either. Ilse was in the room in the CEO role, moving through the industry contacts with the contained efficiency she had always brought to these contexts. She wore a dark blazer over a shirt the color of slate, and the watch on her right wrist caught the June light differently than the December light had caught it. Warmer, more direct. She looked, as she always looked in rooms like this, like the most competent person in it. She was also, since March, the person I went home to on most evenings, which I had told exactly 2 people, Brig, who had received this information with a single slow nod and the particular satisfaction of someone whose long-held assessment had been formally confirmed, and my sister in Portland, who had asked 2 follow-up questions and then said that anyone who enrolled in culinary school over someone's cooking comment was clearly serious. After my presentation, a food journalist named Keeler Vance found me at the edge of the room. He was mid-30s, covered food and culture for a national publication, and had the engaged, curious quality of someone who was genuinely interested in the subject he wrote about. He said, that composed bite in the showcase write-up, Rosa Chen's piece from December, the stone fruit and fermented plum. Who developed that one? I said, our CEO developed that one. She's been cooking seriously for about 8 months. He looked across the room at Ilse, who was at that moment in conversation with a restaurant group CEO, fully present and professional and entirely herself. He said, that's unexpected. I said, she's the most committed learner I've ever seen. When she decides to understand something, she understands it completely. He said, Rosa called it extraordinary. I said Rosa was right. He said, I might reach out to her for a profile piece. The CEO as serious cook angle. I said, You should. The food is worth the conversation. He moved off across the room toward Ilse with the purposeful energy of a journalist who has decided on a subject. I watched him introduce himself. Watched Ilse receive the introduction. Watched her clock. With the peripheral awareness she brought to everything, that I was on the other side of the room watching the introduction happen. She looked across at me. In the full bright June light of the venue, with the room full of people and the industry gathering going on around us, she looked at me the way she had been looking at me from the periphery for 2.5 years, except that it was not from the periphery anymore, and she was not managing it, and neither was I. I held the look for a moment. Then I turned back to the colleague I had been talking with before Keeler arrived, and I answered his question about the spring editorial direction, and I did not look at Ilse again for another 20 minutes because I did not need to. After the event, we walked out into the June evening together. The city was doing what it does on warm June nights, loud and alive and generous with itself, the streets full of people who were glad to be outside and not pretending otherwise. She had her jacket over her arm. The watch caught the last of the evening light. She said, "The journalist wants to do a profile piece." I said, "I know." I told him he should. She said, "You told him the food is worth the conversation." I said, "It is." She said, "He's going to ask about the origin story. Why a CEO enrolled in professional culinary training." I said, "What are you going to tell him?" She walked for a moment. The city noise was around us, and the evening was warm, and I had been learning since March, a person who was very good at thinking before she spoke, and very interesting to watch while she was doing it. She said, "I'm going to tell him that I heard someone I trusted describe a piece of food as extraordinary, and I understood that extraordinary was the standard I needed to work toward, and I enrolled in a culinary program the following afternoon." I said, "That is technically accurate." She said, "It is entirely accurate. Every word of it." I said, "He's going to want to know who." She said, "Yes." I said, "What will you say?" She looked at me. The June light was on her face and the composure was fully present, and so was the thing underneath it. The thing that had been present since the Porto meeting and was no longer being managed at a remove, but was simply there, visible, unhidden. She said, "I will tell him that the extraordinary standard had a specific source, and that I found the source, and that she is currently walking beside me in the June evening, and that the dish is better every week." I said, "It is better every week." She said, "Last Thursday was the best one yet." I said, "The fig and the aged sherry vinegar." She said, "I thought so." I said, "It was extraordinary." She said nothing for a moment. Then she said, "There is that word again." I said, "It's the right word." She said, "Yes, it is." We walked on. The city was bright and generous around us, and neither of us said anything for a while, which was its own kind of language, the specific comfort of two people who have stopped needing to fill silence because the silence itself is honest. She is still the most competent person I have ever worked for. She is also, in the 6 months since the March afternoon in her office, the person I cook beside on Thursday evenings in the Meridian kitchen with the 6-burner range and a bottle of something good, and the particular companionship of two people who both understand that food is never really about food. The Thursday evenings have their own texture now. She arrives before I do, always. Has the range warming and the ingredients organized in the precise way she has learned, through 8 months of serious instruction, that preparation is the foundation everything else rests on. The mise en place is never showy. It is simply correct. I arrive with wine and sometimes an ingredient I have been thinking about, which she incorporates if it fits and declines if it doesn't, and the declining is as informative as the incorporating. We argue about technique. We agree about flavor. We occasionally produce something neither of us expected and stand at the counter eating it in the specific quiet of two people who trust each other's palate enough to let the food speak first. She is getting better every week. The Thursday sessions continue. She still attends, still asks the better questions, still comes home from the program having practiced whatever was covered in the session and wanting to talk about it with someone whose opinion she trusts. The dish has changed 4 times since December. It is different now, more confident, less architectural, carrying a warmth that the December version did not have, because the December version was made in secret by a woman who had not yet given herself permission to make it as a declaration. The current version is, in my considered opinion, extraordinary. She disagrees about the fermented element. She thinks I have been accommodating a slight imbalance in the acid arrival because I am emotionally compromised in the matter of her cooking, which is both accurate and completely beside the point. I tell her the imbalance is a feature, not a fault. She tells me that is not a standard she is willing to apply to her own work. We have been having this argument for 3 months. I expect we will have it for considerably longer. I expect this with a completeness that has nothing to do with resolution, and everything to do with the specific pleasure of being in an argument with someone whose standards are as high as yours, and whose opinion you trust as much as your own. She enrolled in culinary school the afternoon after I called another woman's cooking extraordinary. She put her name on a break room dish in December, and her hand in mine in March, and her honest answer in the space between us every Thursday evening since. That is, in the most accurate possible use of the word, extraordinary.